was, in principle, redeemable in gold and silver, but in fact was put out, emitted, as the old expression had it, was emitted in excess. So they might have in their vault only a million silver dollars, but they had emitted $2 million worth of bank paper money. This was called the fractional reserve system.
There we go.
The problem with this system is it really rewards imprudence. The bankers want to expand as much as possible, and obviously people want to borrow as much as possible. So on both sides of that transaction, there are people who are willing to push the envelope, as the expression goes.
Right, and I mean, you could say that's just straight fraud.
Well, you could say it's a straight fraud after a certain point. I mean, the problem with fractional reserve banking is the bankers always had to make a calculation. How far can we go with this before people lose confidence in our bank currency, bring that bank currency back for redemption, we can't redeem it, and then we have a bank run and we collapse.
Okay,
right?
so you're saying...
always had that problem.
Right, you're saying, in your opinion, a certain amount of fractional reserve lending is acceptable in the marketplace in order to allow the economy to expand.
Well, I don't necessarily know that it allows the economy to expand, because it all depends upon to what kind of investment that is used. But let's put it this way, from the point of view of fraud, if you disclose that this is what you're doing, so that a person who sees that banknote knows that this note does not represent necessarily an actual coin in the vault of that bank, and that if I'm taking this note, I am at risk because the bank may not have enough to redeem this note if I bring it in. And he's still willing to do that with all that information disclosed. Right, we're talking like something like an SEC prospectus for securities, right?
Mm-hmm,
with all that information disclosed, if a person is willing to take that and use that, I would say he takes his chances in the marketplace, caveat emptor. If he ends up with a worthless banknote, too bad for him.
He knew it, so therefore, yeah.
He knew it. So there was no fraud on either side.
Right.
It was a risk. It was a speculation. And if he speculates that way and loses, well, that's the way the market tends to work.
Right.
For some people, right? Our problem has always been twofold. First, that very large numbers of people who have been using the fractional reserve system since the early days, and we're talking from the early 1800s on, did not really understand how this thing functioned. There was not what I would call complete disclosure by the bank.
Mm-hmm.
That was number one.
They certainly made no effort to explain it to those who didn't ask.
Well, that's right. And if you look at the classic example in my mind, 1933, 1931, 32, there's a banking collapse. Eventually all the banks are closed by the end of 1932. Roosevelt is elected. He comes on as president, gives his first fireside chat in 1933, March of 1933, and he tells the American people, listen, you may think that you have money there in the bank when you deposit it, but it's not really there. The bank has gone and loaned it out various ways, and so they're not entirely liquid, and that's why we're having these bank runs, and that's why the bank's closed, and we've got to give them time to get their investments in order and so forth and so on. He was explaining to the American people on national radio how fractional reserve banking worked. And his assumption was, in this explanation, that his listeners didn't already understand it. That's what I found fascinating, is the President of the United States had to tell people that they didn't understand how the banks were working.
Right, which is a condition we're very familiar with these days, but...
But that was 33. So that's problem number one. The banks really did not disclose to the average person what the dangers were economically of using this system.
Right,
and then secondly, when those dangers appeared, when they had bank runs, that was typically what happened. Right? When they had what they call bank stringencies or panics, financial panics, the banks would then turn to the government for some kind of special protection. They'd say, listen, we want to have what they used to call suspension of specie payments. We don't want to have to redeem our notes as they come in, but we still want to collect from our debtors. Right? We don't want to pay our debts, but we want to collect from our debtors for some period of time until we can finally stabilize ourselves and reduce this pyramid of lending that we've generated. And then once we're stable, we will resume specie payments.
Right.
And why would the governments go along with this? Well, because the government's politicians discovered that banks were a very useful way to monetize government debt.
Right. So the politicians, they love this deal because they get all the money they want for all the programs they want to implement. Great deal.
Well, that's exactly right. As soon as they recognized this, they suddenly saw that here was a way that they could spend money without immediate taxation.
Right. So in reality, this is nothing more than a Ponzi scheme, classic in the classic sense of any definition of it. Only when the Ponzi scheme's about to run itself to an end, the bankers go to the government and say, no, we don't want this whole thing to come crashing down. Let's change the rules a little bit here.
Right, and they've done it systematically. I mean, they did it with an attempt to set up central banks, first and second Bank of the United States. Then they set up the national banking system during the Civil War. Then they set up the Federal Reserve System. And now this big Ponzi scheme is coming down, and they're talking about some global currency or regional currency, or take it to the next level. That's always been their scheme. Take it to the next level, take it to the next level. Give us a higher level, what they call lender of last resort, that can generate more of this phony currency to keep the bubble expanded.
Exactly.
So that's been the sequence. And it can lead in only one direction towards, well, it depends on, I suppose, which way the pendulum, which end of the stroke the pendulum is at when the collapse comes. You can have depression, you can have hyperinflation, or more likely what looks like what's going to come is a combination of depression with hyperinflation. So you'll have huge numbers of people out of work and the value of the currency dropping like something from Bolivia.
Mm-hmm. And of course, and of course, at the same time, you have the government expanding at such a rapid rate, taking over as much of the economy as they can, so that they have controls over these things to try to slow the process in any one direction or the other, which is ultimately leading to a loss of freedom, economically and otherwise, for the American people and the globe, for that matter.
Oh, exactly, and that's because we go back to that fundamental first point that I made. Constitution provided for a monetary system ultimately controlled by the free market. All of these changes that we've seen, all of them unconstitutional, have provided for more and more control of the monetary system by the political authorities and the big economic interests behind those political authorities. And they cannot keep that system going without, A, regimenting the free market, and then when people respond in a negative way to that, regimenting the people.
Right.
This thing has to lead to something that looks like classical socialism or classical fascism. I think more classical fascism than socialism because of the nature of the interest groups that are behind it. It has to go that way as long as we maintain a monetary system which is not constitutional and directed towards market control of the money supply.
Exactly. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you are learning something today, if you already knew this information and you're glad to hear it talked about in detail, of course, make sure you check out Dr. Edwin Vieira, his book Pieces of Eight, newswithviews.com. Click on Edwin Vieira's link, and you can find out how to get involved in getting a reprint of that book. Peter Schiff, of course, is what this day is all about. Peter Schiff understands this process as well that we've been discussing. And he's talking about it. He's been talking about it in any way he can on the financial networks for years now, been predicting the ultimate outcome of this system continuing down the road it's going, and he's been right. And he's been laughed at, but he's been proven right as time goes on. He's making some other dire predictions right now, but the bottom line is, if you want some honesty, if you want to hear this talked about in our government, in Congress, that is the point of today. Go to shiftforsenate.com, make a contribution, let Peter know that you have his back, that you will fight against the powerful entity that is Chris Dodd and his backers. We will put them out, and we will put a man in who's going to start talking the truth about these matters, talking to the American people. Maybe, in a sense, just like Roosevelt tried to explain so many years ago, maybe we'll get somebody up there explaining and